There are some mothers whose stories don't belong in the realm of true crime. They belong in nightmares. California has seen its share of infamous killers, serial murderers, cult leaders, and cold-blooded criminals whose names echo through history. But among them stands a case so disturbing, so psychologically twisted, that it forces us to confront an uncomfortable truth. Some of the most terrifying monsters aren't strangers lurking in the dark. They're mothers living inside the home. This is the story of Theresa Cross Knorr, one of California's most brutal and psychologically complex murderers. A woman whose paranoia, narcissism, and violent delusions turned her own daughters into prisoners and ultimately victims. It is a case almost too horrific to believe. Torture, isolation, starvation, fire, and the ultimate betrayal, a mother murdering her daughters and forcing her sons to help. But behind the shocking crimes lies something deeper. A collapsing mind. A psychological breakdown fueled by jealousy, trauma, rage, and delusion. A woman who saw her own children, not as humans, but as threats. Tonight, we peel back every layer. Her upbringing, her abusive relationships, the gradual unraveling of her sanity, and the dark transformation into one of California's most evil mothers. This is not just a recounting of crimes. It is a descent into the psychology of a woman who believed murder was justified, even necessary. This is Theresa Knorr, the mother who tortured her own daughters. And this is episode 1 of California's Most Evil Mothers: Dark Psychology Behind Family Killers. Monsters are not born fully formed. They are shaped, molded by the shadows they grow up in. And the story of Theresa Cross Knorr begins long before she ever laid a hand on her daughters. It begins in Sacramento, California, inside a household that looked ordinary from the outside, but was rotting from within. Because before Theresa became a murderer, she learned what violence feels like. She learned what instability looks like. She learned that love can be withdrawn, weaponized, or used to manipulate. Every villain has an origin story. This is hers. 1. A childhood written in fear. Theresa Veronica Cross was born on March 12, 1946, into a family already struggling to stay together. Her father, Suesan Cross, was a machinist, hard-working but strict, a man shaped by the Great Depression and the expectation that children were to be controlled, not nurtured. Her mother, Suesan May, was fragile, emotionally and physically. She suffered health issues, depression, and long periods of instability. And in that kind of home, structure collapses and survival becomes the only priority. Growing up, Theresa didn't get the kind of affection children need to develop empathy. There were no bedtime stories, no comforting arms, no consistency. She grew up learning. Love is conditional. Anger equals control. Fear equals respect. And people who hurt you are still people you depend on. This is the breeding ground for emotional instability. And for Theresa, it was only the beginning. 2. The death that changed everything. When Theresa was just 14 years old, tragedy struck. Her father, the only consistent authority in her life, collapsed and died of congestive heart failure. To a young teenage girl already struggling with insecurity and abandonment issues, this loss was catastrophic. A father's death doesn't just remove a parent, it removes the rules, the expectations, the structure. And Theresa reacted the way many psychologically fragile teenagers do. she unraveled. Her behavior changed dramatically. She became rebellious, violent, manipulative, obsessed with attention, quick to anger, quick to punish. But beneath all of this was something deeper, a girl who felt powerless and vowed never to feel powerless again. When people lose love early, some spend their lives seeking it. But when that love was never stable to begin with, some spend their lives controlling others instead. Theresa chose control. 3. Early signs of narcissism and emotional instability. Friends and relatives later described teenage Theresa as jealous, suspicious, easily angered, emotionally volatile, obsessed with being admired, manipulative, convinced the world owed her something. She showed early traits of narcissistic personality disorder: grandiosity, explosive overreactions, a belief that she was smarter than others, cruelty masked as confidence, a need to dominate conversations, a need to dominate people, and most importantly, she never accepted responsibility for anything. Every problem was someone else's fault. Every argument was someone attacking her. Every mistake was someone betraying her. This pattern would define her entire life. 4. The early marriage that fueled the fire. Theresa married her first husband, Clifford Sanders, at just 15 years old. Most teenagers that age are still in school, still discovering themselves. But Theresa? Theresa was already playing the role of a grown woman, a wife, a mother, and ultimately a tyrant. 2 months after her 16th birthday, she gave birth to her first child, Howard. But instead of motherhood softening her, it hardened her. She became controlling, possessive, jealous, paranoid. She accused Clifford of cheating constantly. She monitored where he went. She interrogated him when he returned. She punished him emotionally and sometimes physically. This wasn't a marriage. It was the early laboratory for Theresa's need for domination. And Clifford became her first victim. 5. The murder of her first husband. On July 6, 1964, Theresa claimed that Clifford had hit her. And like many abusers, she flipped the narrative. But what happened next was not self-defense. Not even close. Theresa picked up a rifle, loaded it, walked toward Clifford, and fired a bullet into his heart. Cold, deliberate, calculated. It was her first known killing, but it wouldn't be her last. During the trial, Theresa sat in court, pregnant again, portraying herself as a fragile, terrified young mother. And stunningly, she was acquitted. The jury bought the image, the tears, the manipulation. She killed her husband and walked away free. It was the moment that shaped everything. Theresa learned she could kill and escape consequences. She learned her emotions were weapons. Her victimhood was a shield. Her charm could sway a courtroom. Her children would learn this too, but they would learn it the hard way. 6. A pattern of men, violence, and control. Theresa went on to marry and divorce multiple men after Clifford's death. Each marriage followed the same pattern. Initial charm, sudden jealousy, emotional volatility, physical violence, manipulation, accusations. Her emotional instability was escalating. Her cruelty was sharpening. And with each failed relationship, Theresa's rage turned inward toward the people who couldn't escape her, her children. 7. A mother who saw threats instead of children. Theresa had 6 children, but she did not see them as children. She saw them as extensions of herself. symbols of loyalty, tools, threats, sources of jealousy, emotional punching bags, scapegoats for her failures. And this is the most chilling part. Michelle, Suesan, Robert, William, Sheila, and Theresa Jr. grew up believing their mother's rage was normal. They grew up learning that crying made things worse, that fear was expected, that obedience meant survival, that leaving was impossible. What they didn't know was that two of them, Suesan and Sheila, would not survive their mother's house. All the pain Theresa had absorbed in her own childhood, all the rage she had swallowed, all the insecurity she carried, she poured into her daughters. Not gradually, not subtly, but violently. And the next chapter in this story would be one of the darkest in California's history. By the time Theresa Knorr reached her early 30s, her home was no longer a home. It had become something darker. A place ruled by paranoia, violence, and psychological domination. And her children were not a family. They were inmates. Every true crime case has a turning point, the moment an ordinary person descends into someone unrecognizable. But with Theresa, there was nothing sudden about it. Her cruelty evolved slowly, methodically, like a shadow growing longer as the sun sets. And inside her Sacramento apartment, the sun had already gone down. The first signs of hell inside the home. From the outside, neighbors described Theresa as quiet, stern, and unfriendly. She rarely spoke. She rarely smiled. Her children appeared thin, silent, and afraid. Inside, the reality was far worse. Theresa controlled everything. What her children ate, when they ate, when they slept, what they wore, who they spoke to, what they said, whether they were allowed outside, whether they were allowed to laugh. Her word wasn't law, it was survival. If Theresa was in a bad mood, and she often was, the entire house walked on eggshells. One wrong glance, one wrong tone, one wrong breath, and the fear began. Her children learned early. Do not provoke the monster. 2. A bent. The children become extensions of Theresa's paranoia. Theresa's psychological instability was worsening. Her paranoia deepened every year. She believed people were talking about her. Men were cheating on her. Her daughters were stealing her beauty. Her sons were secretly plotting against her. Social workers were watching her. Doctors wanted to control her. Outsiders were dangerous. Leaving the house was a threat. Trusting anyone was impossible. And as her delusions grew, her children's world shrank. They weren't allowed to visit friends. They weren't allowed to have privacy. They weren't allowed to close their doors. They weren't allowed to express emotion. Anything, even the slightest sign of independence, could be interpreted as rebellion. And rebellion meant punishment. 3. Mommy's rage, the ungoverned violence. Theresa didn't hit her children in bursts of anger like an overwhelmed parent. She hit them with purpose, with intention, with a level of cruelty that hinted at something darker than simple violence. Paddles, belts, hangers, knives, her fists, her feet, anything within reach. The children were beaten for crying, not crying, eating too slowly, eating too quickly, making noise, being too quiet, looking tired, looking defiant, acting like Clifford, their dead father, acting like whores, a phrase she aimed at her daughters. The punishments were unpredictable. That made them more effective. Because the children didn't know what might set her off, they lived in constant, silent terror. 4. Isolation, Theresa's most powerful weapon. The more unstable Theresa became, the tighter she gripped control. She isolated the children from the world. No school, no doctors, no vacations, no friends, no extended family, no holidays, no outside contact. She homeschooled them, or at least pretended to, keeping them trapped within the shrinking walls of her paranoia. And by isolating them, she made escape impossible. There were no teachers noticing bruises, no neighbors hearing screams, no family members checking on the kids. The apartment became a closed system, a universe where Theresa was God, judge, and executioner. 5. The punishment room. Theresa used a small, cramped bedroom as a place of silence and control. When a child disobeyed, or Theresa imagined they disobeyed, they were sent into the room. No food, no water, lights off, hours or days at a time. For the children, it was a psychological torture chamber. They said the room broke them. They forgot time. They forgot hope. They forgot themselves. And when they emerged, they were quieter, more obedient, more afraid. Theresa didn't just punish her children physically. She punished their identity. 6. Theresa's special obsession, her daughters. There is something uniquely disturbing about Theresa's relationship with her daughters. She didn't just abuse them. She saw them as rivals. Her daughters, especially Suesan and Sheila, were treated differently. Their hair was cut short. They were forbidden makeup, were called sluts, whores, bitches. Theresa accused them of trying to seduce her men. She accused them of betraying her. She accused Suesan of practicing witchcraft. She accused Sheila of having devilish intentions. Theresa wasn't just jealous. She was delusional. She believed her daughters were stealing something from her. Her youth, her beauty, her control, her importance. In Theresa's mind, her daughters were threats to be neutralized. And eventually, that delusion killed them. The sons, from victims to unwilling accomplices. Theresa's sons, Howard, William, and Robert, were also abused, but they served a different purpose in her delusional world. They were tools, extensions of her violence, hands she used when hers weren't enough. Theresa forced them to lock them in rooms, hold them down, cover up bruises, hide injuries, lie to outsiders, assist in the punishments. This turned the boys into unwilling accomplices, traumatized children trying to survive by following orders. They weren't monsters. They were children trapped inside a nightmare. A mother who forces her children to harm each other is doing more than committing violence. She is destroying the bond between siblings, the one thing that could unite them against her. Divide and conquer. Theresa understood this instinctively. 8. The moment the children realized they weren't safe. The older the children grew, the more dangerous Theresa became, especially toward her daughters. Theresa became obsessed with Suesan's weight, her appearance, her emerging independence. She accused her of wanting attention, stealing men, bringing shame, acting like a witch. She even accused Suesan of being possessed. Delusion had taken over the home. The moment the children realized they were not merely punished, but in genuine danger, was when Theresa stabbed Suesan in the chest during an argument. One moment of rage, one flash of a knife, one violent strike. The children froze, stunned, silent, and then the world fractured. Theresa didn't comfort her daughter, didn't rush her to medical care, didn't apologize. She only snarled, "You made me do this." That sentence, that chilling abuser's mantra, marked the beginning of the end. From that day forward, the children knew their mother was capable of killing them, and they were right. 9. The delusion that sealed Suesan's fate. After the stabbing, Suesan struggled to recover. She grew thin. She grew pale. She moved slowly. And instead of feeling guilt, Theresa developed a new delusion. She became convinced that the bullet lodged inside Suesan's body from a previous violent episode was poisoning her. Theresa believed that the only way to save Suesan was to cut the bullet out herself with a kitchen knife. No anesthesia, no sterilization, no medical knowledge, just a mother and a knife, and a delusion so deep it drowned her sanity. This was no longer abuse. This was fantasy-driven violence. And once Theresa crossed that line, there was no going back. 10. Isolation, abuse, and the final breaking point. By the time Suesan was 17, Theresa had broken her physically and psychologically. Starvation, beatings, isolation, stabbings, forced imprisonment. She was a ghost, the shadow of a girl who once had dreams, friends, hope. But even in her weakened state, even after everything she had endured, Suesan still tried to escape. And that act, that final attempt to reclaim her life, triggered Theresa's deepest fear, losing control. Inside Theresa's fractured mind, escape wasn't independence. It was betrayal. And in her own twisted logic, betrayal deserved death. There are cases in true crime that disturb you. There are cases that haunt you. And then there is the story of Theresa Knorr, a teenage girl whose final years were a descent into unimaginable suffering at the hands of the woman who was supposed to protect her. This is not a story of a sudden attack or a moment of uncontrolled rage. This is the story of torture, of gradual destruction, of a mother whose psychological collapse consumed her child. And it begins with a knife and a delusion strong enough to kill. 1. The stabbing that changed everything. The moment Theresa stabbed her daughter Suesan in the chest, something irreversible happened inside that apartment. For most parents, an injury like this would be a wake-up call, a sign that something has gone terribly wrong. But Theresa's mind didn't work like that. Instead of guilt, she felt justified. Instead of fear, she felt confirmed. In her paranoia, instead of remorse, she blamed Suesan. "You made me do this." That sentence echoed through the apartment. A sentence spoken by abusers, mothers who harm, and killers who believe their victims deserved it. For Suesan, the stabbing was not an isolated event. It was the beginning of the end. 2. The aftermath. Suesan weakens. For months, Suesan struggled to recover on her own. She grew weak. Her breathing became labored. Her skin turned pale. She could barely eat. She could barely stand. A wound like that, untreated, infected, would have hospitalized anyone, but Suesan was a prisoner. Her mother refused medical care. She refused doctors, nurses, hospitals, or anyone who could see the truth behind the apartment walls. Because outside eyes meant exposure, and exposure meant losing control. To Theresa, Suesan wasn't dying from abuse. She was acting dramatic, and she was being a liar. She was making herself sick on purpose. Abusers always shift the blame. But Theresa's mind was moving into darker territory, delusion. 3. Theresa's new delusion. Years earlier, during another violent episode, Theresa had shot Suesan in the chest. The bullet remained lodged inside her body. Most parents would seek medical help. Theresa didn't. Doctors meant questions. Questions meant risk. And risk was something Theresa could not tolerate. But as Suesan's health declined, Theresa developed a horrifying belief. She became convinced the bullet was poisoning her daughter from the inside, not because of science, not because of reality, but because paranoia had become her logic. In her mind, the bullet was toxic. It was spreading infection. It was corrupting Suesan's blood. It was the reason for the illness. And only she, the mother, could save her child. Narcissism and delusion are a devastating combination. Theresa didn't trust anybody but herself. Not doctors, not professionals, not even her children. Only she could fix the problem. And so she decided to operate. 4. The surgery. A kitchen knife and delusion. This was not a medical procedure. This was not care. This was torture disguised as love. Theresa prepared an amateur surgery using a kitchen knife, rubbing alcohol, a bottle of whiskey, towels on the floor. Her sons to assist, her delusion to justify it. She placed Suesan on the carpet, held down by her siblings, trembling and terrified. She was 17 years old, and she understood that her life was entirely in her mother's hands. Theresa poured whiskey into Suesan's mouth, telling her it would numb the pain. It didn't. Then she pressed the knife into her daughter's skin and cut. Suesan screamed, begged, cried, but Theresa didn't stop. She believed she was removing the poison. She believed she was saving her daughter. She believed her delusion more than her child's pain. That is the terrifying nature of a collapsing mind. It convinces itself that violence is mercy, that torture is care, that death is rescue. 5. Suesan's body begins to fail. After the so-called surgery, Suesan went into shock. She vomited, she sweated, she shook. She fainted repeatedly. She couldn't walk, she couldn't eat. She couldn't keep down water. Her wound became infected almost instantly. Her brothers watched her deteriorate, powerless, traumatized, terrified. And Theresa became angry. She believed Suesan was exaggerating. She believed she was being ungrateful. She believed she was making her look bad. When abusers lose control, they don't take responsibility. They seek new justification, and Theresa did what she always did. She blamed Suesan. 6. The attempted escape. One day, in a brief moment when Theresa was distracted, Suesan crawled toward the front door, not ran, not walked, crawled, barely conscious, desperate for survival. She made it outside. She made it onto the front lawn. She made it far enough that escape was possible. But she didn't get far. Theresa discovered her, dragged her back inside, beat her until she could no longer move, and locked her in the bathroom. This wasn't punishment. This was containment. Theresa now believed her daughter, weakened, starving, wounded, was a threat. Not because she could fight, but because she could tell. 7. The decision to end her life. It was after the escape attempt that Theresa made the most chilling decision of her life. She gathered her children in the living room and declared, "Suesan has betrayed this family." In Theresa's warped mind, Suesan's trauma was rebellion. Her illness was manipulation. Her screams were disrespect. Her desire to escape was treachery. Her presence was danger. Theresa believed that the only way to preserve control, the only way to protect the family, was to eliminate the problem. Her delusion evolved again. Now she believed Suesan was possessed, evil, a danger to the household. And so Theresa presented her solution. Suesan had to die. The children sat frozen. Not one of them dared to speak. Not one of them dared to resist. Because in that house, resistance meant death. The murder of Suesan Knorr. The details of Suesan's death are among the most disturbing in California's true crime history. Theresa ordered her sons, Robert and William, to carry their sister's frail, dying body outside. They lifted her carefully, trying not to cause more pain. But she moaned with every movement. They placed her into the family car. Theresa forced Sheila, Suesan's sister, to join them. The car ride was silent, tense, cold. They drove to a remote area near Squaw Valley. Theresa instructed her sons to place Suesan on the ground near a clearing. Suesan, barely conscious, whispered, "Please, don't leave me." But Theresa had already made up her mind. She handed her son a can of gasoline and ordered him to pour it over his sister. He hesitated. For a moment, a tiny moment, he hesitated, but the fear inside him was greater than his love, greater than his instinct. He obeyed. When the gasoline touched Suesan's skin, she screamed, a scream that echoed through the trees and was swallowed by the night. Theresa struck a match and set her daughter on fire. Flames engulfed her. The forest lit up. The children watched in horror, and Theresa stared without remorse. A mother watched her daughter burn and believed she had done the right thing. 9. Disposal and denial. The family drove home. No one spoke. No one cried. No one dared to breathe too loudly. Theresa told the children, "We will never talk about this again." And they didn't, because silence was survival. Later, a local man discovered the burned remains of a teenage girl. She was never identified at the time. Theresa told her children the case would disappear. And she was right. The world didn't know her name. The authorities didn't know her story. For years, Suesan Knorr was simply Jane Doe X. 10. The aftermath. Trauma, silence, and a family breaking apart. After Suesan's murder, the atmosphere in the home changed completely. Terrified, broken, numb. The children learned their mother could kill. Their mother would kill, and none of them were safe. Every day became a strategy for survival. Theresa grew more paranoid, more volatile, more convinced that the world was out to harm her. And now that she had killed once, the line between violence and murder was gone. The next victim would be Sheila. But that is for the next section. Suesan's death should have been the breaking point. The moment Theresa realized the horror of what she had done. The moment a mother collapses under the weight of her own brutality. But that's not what happened. Theresa didn't break. She grew darker, more paranoid, more controlling, more convinced that every problem in her life came from the girls she had raised. And as the years went on, her delusions found a new target. Her daughter, Sheila. Suesan was gone, but Theresa was far from finished, because in her mind, there was still one more danger left in the house. One, after Suesan, a house in silence. The months following Suesan's murder were thick with fear. The apartment fell silent. The children barely spoke. They tiptoed around their mother like shadows, careful, invisible, terrified of her moods. Every morning, they woke wondering, who will she target today? Theresa's delusions became more severe. She believed neighbors were spying on her. She believed social workers would steal her children. She believed men she dated were plotting against her. She believed the police were watching the house. She believed the TV was sending messages. She believed spirits were trying to influence her daughters. Delusion transformed into obsession. And obsession always needs a focus. Sheila became that focus. 2. Sheila, the daughter Theresa couldn't control. Unlike Suesan, who had withdrawn into fear and frailty, Sheila grew into a bright, sociable, warm young woman. Even inside the prison of Theresa's home, Sheila found ways to shine. She made friends easily. She was kind to her siblings. She dreamed of independence. She wanted to work, to live, to experience the world. She wanted something beyond the walls of Theresa's mind. And to Theresa, this was unforgivable. Sheila's emerging adulthood triggered everything inside Theresa. Her jealousy, her fear of abandonment, her paranoia about losing control, her hatred of competition, her obsession with loyalty. Sheila was becoming a woman. Beautiful, capable, independent. And Theresa, aging, bitter, delusional, saw her daughter's youth as theft. She believed Sheila was stealing her attention, her beauty, her son's affection, her freedom, her control. Theresa convinced herself Sheila had turned against her. And once Theresa believed something, it became reality. 3. The lockdown. Theresa cuts off the outside world. Theresa tightened her grip on her children like a noose. No visitors, no phone calls, no jobs unless Theresa approved. No friendships unless Theresa monitored them. But Sheila, unlike her siblings, pushed back. She wanted to work. She wanted freedom. She wanted something normal. Theresa allowed her to get a job at a local donut shop, but only if she handed over all her wages. To most parents, a daughter working is a milestone. To Theresa, it was a threat. Sheila was making friends, talking to customers, laughing, smiling. Theresa saw every smile as betrayal, every friend as enemy, every paycheck as independence. And nothing terrified her more than a child she could no longer control. 4. The accusation that triggered everything. Theresa developed a new delusion, one so dangerous, so irrational that it sealed Sheila's fate. She started claiming that Sheila had contracted a sexually transmitted disease, a disease she was bringing into the home, a disease infecting the family. No evidence, no medical exam, no symptoms, only paranoia. In Theresa's twisted logic, if Sheila had an STD, then she was dirty. If she was dirty, she was sinning. If she was sinning, she was being used by demons. If she was influenced by demons, she was a threat. Theresa's delusion convinced her Sheila was possessed. And when a paranoid mind believes someone is possessed, two outcomes follow: cleansing or elimination. There, Theresa chose both. 5. The cleansing ritual, a new form of torture. Theresa forced Sheila to strip naked. She forced her to stand in the living room while she interrogated her. She forced her to confess to things she didn't do: sleeping with men, seducing strangers, bringing evil spirits, contaminating the household, trying to escape, plotting to destroy the family. Sheila denied every accusation. But in Theresa's mind, denial was proof of guilt. She ordered Sheila to take repeated cleansing baths, boiling hot water, harsh chemicals, soap, scrubbing until her skin bled. Sheila cried, banged, screamed, but Theresa saw tears as evidence of possession. The more Sheila suffered, the more justified Theresa felt. 6. The closet, turning punishment into imprisonment. Theresa's paranoia reached a breaking point. She declared, "Sheila is contaminated. She's dangerous to this family. She needs to be isolated." Theresa then dragged Sheila toward a small, narrow hallway closet. She ordered her sons to tie her arms. They hesitated, but they obeyed. Just like with Suesan, they obeyed. The closet was barely large enough to sit. No air circulation, no light, no water, no space. It was not punishment. It was imprisonment. Theresa locked the door. She said Sheila would remain there until she was clean. Hours passed. Then days. The children heard her crying, her coughing, her begging for water, her promises that she wasn't sick, her pleas for help, her weakening voice, her silence. Theresa refused to open the door. She refused to believe Sheila was dying. She refused to acknowledge reality. Abusers don't need truth, they need control. And in that closet, Theresa had absolute control. 7. The slow death of Sheila Knorr. Sheila died alone in that closet. Starvation, dehydration, exhaustion, heat, fear, infection, trauma. A combination so lethal, she never had a chance. She was 20 years old. 20. People her age were in college, falling in love, starting careers, beginning life. But Sheila's life ended in darkness, behind a door locked by the woman who brought her into the world. When the children realized Sheila was no longer making noise, no longer moving, no longer alive, they begged Theresa to open the door. She refused. She said Sheila was faking. And when she finally did open it, Sheila's body collapsed onto the floor. Her siblings screamed. Theresa didn't. She stared at her daughter's lifeless body and said, "She was possessed. Now it's over." 8. Disposal. The garbage bag burial. Suesan burned. Sheila would not receive even a burial. Theresa forced her sons to put Sheila's body into a green plastic garbage bag. They were shaking, crying, traumatized. But once again, they obeyed. Together, they carried the body to a dumpster behind a local apartment complex. They lifted the bag, they dropped it in, and walked away. A daughter reduced to trash. A life reduced to nothing. The bag was later found by city workers. Her death was ruled a drug overdose. No one suspected family homicide. And for years, she too became a Jane Doe without justice. 9. Theresa's final state, a mother without humanity. After Sheila's death, Theresa's delusion still wasn't satisfied. She believed Sheila had deserved it. The infection was gone. The apartment was clean. The family was safe again. She had done the right thing. There was no grief, no sorrow, no regret. Her children described her behavior as emotionless, cold, robotic, detached, indifferent, almost proud. Theresa believed she had saved her family, at least until her paranoia found its next target. Her youngest daughter, Theresa Jr., and her son Robert. The killing might have stopped, but the destruction was far from over, because the only thing stronger than Theresa's rage was her need to survive. And when her children began to turn against her, when they began to see the truth, Theresa realized that her greatest threat was no longer Sheila, no longer Suesan. It was exposure. By the time Sheila's body was dumped into a garbage bin behind an apartment complex, the Knorr children were no longer simply victims. They were survivors. Survivors of torture. Survivors of imprisonment. Survivors of delusion. Survivors of a mother who had turned motherhood into a weapon. But surviving Theresa Knorr wasn't the hardest part. Escaping her was. For years, the children lived in a world where the walls weren't made of plaster and wood. They were made of fear. Fear of Theresa's rage. Fear of her violence. Fear of her ability to kill. Fear of the consequences of speaking out. Fear that no one would believe them. Because how do you explain to the outside world that your mother, the woman who fed you, housed you, birthed you, was torturing you? How do you tell someone that your sister burned alive? How do you admit you were forced to participate? Shame, fear, trauma, all of it kept the children silent. But silence cannot last forever. And in the Knorr household, the silence was beginning to crack. One after Sheila, a home falling apart. Sheila's death broke something inside the remaining children. They moved like ghosts. They spoke in whispers. They stared at the floor. They avoided Theresa's eyes. Because the message was clear. If it happened to Suesan, if it happened to Sheila, it could happen to any of them. Theresa's paranoia didn't quiet after the killings. It intensified. She accused her children of watching her, plotting against her, talking behind her back, trying to leave her, being influenced by evil, wanting to destroy the family. Paranoia becomes self-feeding. Once Theresa believed her daughters were threats, her brain began searching for new threats. And she found one. Her youngest daughter, Theresa Jr. 2. The turning of the tide. Theresa targets her youngest daughter. Theresa Jr., the youngest of the 6 siblings, was quiet, observant, and frightened by the violence around her. She had seen her mother stab Suesan, her sister burn alive, her siblings forced to help, Sheila starved to death, her body dumped like trash. She had lived her entire childhood in terror, and she had only one dream: survival. But after Sheila's death, Theresa Knorr's mind began crafting a new fantasy, a new delusion, centered on her youngest daughter. She decided that Theresa Jr. was disobedient, was disrespectful, was defiant, was lying, was becoming like Sheila, was acting possessed. The parallels were horrifyingly clear. Theresa was preparing to make her third daughter the next target. But this time, something changed. 3. The moment. That sparked the escape. One night after a violent argument, Theresa struck her youngest daughter across the face. This wasn't unusual. Violence was constant. But what came next changed everything. Theresa said, "I should have done to you what I did to the other 2." Silence. A cold, motionless, terrifying silence. Because in that moment, Theresa Jr. knew she was next. Robert knew she wouldn't survive. B. William knew they couldn't stop it. And for the first time, the children realized the truth. Escape wasn't betrayal. Escape was survival. 4. Theresa Jr.'s escape, the first crack in Theresa's control. One morning, when Theresa was passed out drunk on the couch, Theresa Jr. saw her chance. She grabbed her only possessions: a shirt, a pair of jeans, a few coins, a small photo, and ran. Not walked, not slipped out quietly. Ran. She ran barefoot down the street, sobbing, her heart pounding, her hands shaking. She ran past houses filled with families, past people who had no idea a murderer lived just a few doors away, past a world she had never been allowed to touch. She didn't stop until she reached a bus stop. A stranger saw her crying, shaking, covered in marks. He asked if she needed help. She hesitated, afraid, but she nodded. He handed her bus money. She climbed onto the bus, shaking so violently she could barely stand. For the first time in her life, she was free. 5. A new life, but not a safe one. Theresa Jr. left California. She moved from place to place, worked odd jobs, stayed with friends or in shelters, tried to build a new life. But trauma leaves fingerprints. And freedom is hard when the past still breathes down your neck. She was terrified of being found. Terrified her mother would send her brothers to retrieve her. Terrified of speaking out. Every day was survival. Not from her mother, but from the memories. But even though she was free, her brother Robert wasn't. And the weight of that knowledge would eventually break him. 6. Robert's breaking point. Robert Knorr Jr. was the second youngest. He had been forced to participate in the torture of his sisters. He had been forced to carry their bodies. He had been forced to lie to protect a murderer. He was consumed by guilt, haunted by nightmares, haunted by the screams, haunted by fire, haunted by the closet. After Theresa Jr. escaped, Robert remained trapped in the home with Theresa, with the woman who had killed his sisters, and threatened to kill his siblings. Robert knew two truths. 1. Staying meant dying. 2. Leaving meant betraying his mother. For a child raised under a violent mother, those truths feel identical. But in time, the desire to live overcame the indoctrination, and Robert ran. 7. Homeless, broken, and desperate. Robert fled Sacramento with no plan, no money, and no support. He slept outside. He stole food. He drifted from town to town. He began drinking heavily. He struggled with addiction. He carried trauma he couldn't speak about. He was a child who had never known safety. A boy who had been forced into violence. A boy who had been forced to watch his sisters die. A boy who was now alone. And it was this loneliness, this crushing burden, that eventually drove him to the brink. One day, after a minor crime, Robert was arrested and sentenced to time in a Nevada prison. And inside those walls, he broke. But in that breaking, something happened. Something unexpected. Something that changed everything. He confessed. 8. The confession that exposed a murderer. When police questioned Robert about unrelated crimes, he began to unravel emotionally. Years of suppressed trauma began to bleed through. The guilt, the nightmares, the fear, the truth. In a moment of overwhelming emotion, Robert said, "My mom killed my sisters." The detectives paused, not in disbelief, but in recognition that something huge had just been dropped in front of them. At first, they assumed he was hallucinating or exaggerating. But the more he spoke, the clearer it became. Robert wasn't lying. He described the stabbing, the surgery, the burning, the closet, the starvation, the garbage bag, the dumpster, the fear, the escape. Detectives listened in stunned silence. Located the Jane Doe found in the dumpster. Confirmed the age, location, and cause of death. Located surviving siblings. Interviewed Theresa Jr. Interviewed William. Obtained missing person reports. Tracked down relatives. Located Theresa's last known address. Piece by piece, the story came together. 2 murders. 2 teenage girls. 2 lives stolen. And at the center of it all, a mother who believed killing her children was necessary. It was time to confront her. 10. The arrest. Theresa's empire collapses. Theresa Knorr believed she had outsmarted everyone. She believed she had hidden everything. She believed the world would never know. But paranoia cannot protect you forever. Police tracked her down, no longer living in Sacramento, no longer living with her children, no longer in control. When they arrested her, Theresa didn't cry. She didn't panic. She didn't show fear. She didn't show guilt. She simply said, "My children are lying." Even in the face of overwhelming evidence, Theresa's delusion remained intact. To her dying breath, she would maintain her innocence. But the children she tried to silence, the children she raised in terror, the children she thought she owned, they exposed her. They broke the cycle. They survived her. When detectives finally confronted Theresa Knorr, they weren't dealing with a frantic mother, a grieving parent, or even a panicked criminal. They were dealing with a woman so consumed by ego, paranoia, and delusion that even the truth could not penetrate her. Her daughters were dead. Her sons were traumatized. Her last surviving daughter had fled in fear. Her past was unraveling. But Theresa remained certain she had done nothing wrong. And that delusion, the same delusion that fueled years of torture and murder, followed her straight into the justice system. 1. The interrogation, a mother without remorse. When detectives sat across from Theresa for the first time, they expected denial. What they didn't expect was the casual coldness. They asked her about Suesan. She shrugged. They asked her about Sheila. She dismissed it. They asked her about the children she had raised. She called them liars. To detectives who had heard every kind of excuse, every kind of manipulation, every kind of fabrication, Theresa's demeanor was something altogether different. She wasn't trying to convince them of her innocence. She believed in it. Her delusions weren't a performance. They were her worldview. She told investigators, "My children have always been against me. They're trying to punish me. It's none of this happened." But the evidence said otherwise. The timeline said otherwise. The surviving children said otherwise. Theresa didn't know it yet. But the world she controlled for decades was about to collapse. 2. The evidence against Theresa. Prosecutors built the case piece by piece, detail by detail. Suesan's burned remains, found in 1984. Sheila's decomposed body, found in a dumpster in 1985. Theresa Jr.'s eyewitness account. Roberts' confession. Williams' corroboration. The medical evidence. The history of abuse. Theresa's own violent past. Testimonies from extended relatives. Workplace records showing Sheila was missing. Anonymous tips aligning with the timeline. The puzzle was complete. For the first time, the full truth was visible. 2 sisters, tortured, starved, stabbed, burned, abandoned, all at the hands of their mother. Prosecutors didn't see this as a typical murder case. They saw it as one of the most horrific patterns of maternal abuse ever documented in California. But there was one problem. One enormous, frustrating, devastating problem. Most of the evidence was testimony. Most of the crimes had occurred years earlier, and most of the forensic evidence was destroyed or untraceable. Proving murder in court would be difficult. Unless Theresa said something that could be used against her. The bodies were already decomposed or burned. Physical evidence was minimal. Defense lawyers could argue that children were lying. A jury might struggle with the absence of forensic proof. Theresa's mental state could sway jurors into sympathy. The trauma of child witnesses could be exploited by the defense. It was a nightmare scenario. Prosecutors feared that Theresa, a woman who had already gotten away with killing her first husband, could escape justice again. They could not take that risk. Not with two dead young women. Not with decades of torture. Not with surviving children still living in fear. So they did something rare. They offered Theresa a deal. 4. The plea deal, the only way to ensure justice. The plea offer was simple but brutal. Plead guilty to both murders. Serve 2 consecutive life sentences. No possibility of walking free for decades. If she refused, she would face the possibility of the death penalty, the traumatic testimony of her surviving children, the exposure of every dark detail in open court, the risk of a jury not believing her delusion, the risk of a far harsher sentence. Her public defender explained the reality. You will never win this. Your children will testify, and the evidence will bury you. And so the woman who had controlled every person in her home lost control of her own fate. 5. Theresa Knorr's guilty plea. On November 15, 1993, in a Sacramento courtroom, Theresa Knorr stood before a judge. She was asked, "How do you plead to the charge of murdering your daughter, Suesan?" Theresa answered, "Guilty." The courtroom fell silent. Then the judge asked, "And how do you plead to the charge of murdering your daughter, Sheila?" Theresa answered, "Guilty." Just like that. No tears. No tremor in her voice. No remorse. The judge read the charges one by one. The abuse, the torture, the starvation, the confinement, the burning, the disposal. Theresa stared ahead coldly. Silently. When the judge finished, he pronounced her sentence. 2 consecutive life terms in prison. No possibility of parole for 40 years. This meant Theresa would be eligible for release in her late 80s. But in reality, she would never live that long. The psychological profile. Who was Theresa Knorr? Theresa's psychological evaluation revealed the darkest truths behind her crimes. Experts diagnosed severe narcissistic personality disorder, borderline personality disorder, delusional disorder, persecutory type, psychotic features under stress, malignant paranoia, sadistic tendencies, abusive personality disorder, zero empathy for victims. In plain terms, she was not snapping, she was not losing control, she was not temporarily insane. Her violence was purposeful. Her torture was calculated. Her murders were intentional. She was a mother who viewed her children not as humans, but as possessions. Possessions that could be punished. Possessions that could be harmed. Possessions that could be destroyed. One psychologist described her as a woman whose identity is built on dominance, fear, and control, whose children existed only to validate her power. Another said, she exhibits the emotional profile of a cult leader. Theresa wasn't simply abusive. She was totalitarian. 7. Life in prison. Theresa's final years. At the Central California Women's Facility, Theresa quickly developed a reputation. Controlling, manipulative, angry, blaming others, isolating herself, claiming her innocence, denying her crimes, attacking other inmates verbally, filing endless complaints. She refused to attend counseling, refused to acknowledge wrongdoing, refused to speak of her daughters. She lived in the same psychological world she had created in Sacramento, where she was a victim. Her children were traitors. And she was the only person who had ever been right. Even as she aged, her health failing, her influence fading. Therefore, her mind remained locked in delusion. Theresa Knorr never apologized, never expressed responsibility, never expressed sorrow, never admitted the truth. She died exactly as she lived, cold, detached, unrepentant, alone. On December 29, 2022, Theresa Knorr died in prison at 76 years old. No funeral, no family, no mourners. Her legacy, if it can be called that, is carved into the lives she destroyed. 8. The legacy of a monster. Theresa Knorr's story is not just a story of murder. It is a story of how childhood trauma becomes generational trauma, how delusion becomes violence, how narcissism becomes tyranny, how isolation becomes imprisonment, how power becomes abuse, how a mother becomes a killer. Her crimes remain among the most disturbing cases of maternal homicide in American history. She joins a rare list of women whose violence rivals the worst serial killers, not because of the number of victims, but because of the brutality of the method. She didn't kill strangers. She killed her daughters, her children, her own flesh and blood. And she used motherhood itself, the trust, the dependency, the innocence, as a weapon. Theresa Knorr turned her home into a torture chamber. She turned her children into victims, and she turned her daughters into ghosts. The justice system gave her the only punishment it could, a life sentence. But the scars she left behind, emotional, psychological, generational, will always carry the weight of her crimes. When we talk about monsters, we imagine shadows in the dark. We imagine strangers lurking in alleyways. We imagine killers we can see coming, killers we recognize as threats. But the story of Theresa Cross Knorr forces us to confront a truth far more terrifying. Sometimes the monster lives inside the home. Sometimes the monster tucks you into bed. Sometimes the monster has the face of your mother. Theresa Knorr's crimes were not fueled by drugs, money, or opportunity. They were fueled by something deeper, something more insidious, a combination of untreated trauma, malignant narcissism, and delusion that transformed her into one of California's most evil maternal killers. But the final chapter of this documentary isn't just about the end of Theresa Knorr. It's about the lessons her case leaves behind. It's about the psychology of women who kill their children. It's about the survivors. It's about the warning signs that went unnoticed. And it's about the chilling reality of what happens when absolute control goes unchallenged. 1. The psychology of a maternal killer. Why Theresa killed. Theresa Knorr did not wake up one morning and decide to kill her daughters. Her violence was not sudden. It was gradual, deliberate, escalating, predictable. Her psychology formed a deadly combination. Narcissism. My children exist to serve me. She believed her children were extensions of herself, not independent beings. Disobedience wasn't a disagreement. It was betrayal. Paranoia. My children are plotting against me. Her delusions convinced her that Suesan was poisoning her. Sheila was spreading disease. The children were possessed. Everyone was lying. The world was dangerous. Sadistic control. Pain is a method of discipline. She derived psychological gratification from dominance. The fear she created gave her power. The suffering she inflicted confirmed her authority. Isolation. If no one sees it, it never happened. She removed her children from school, cut off family, cut off neighbors, cut off doctors. Isolation is a hallmark of many family annihilators, a way to build a private empire where the abuser is absolute ruler. Delusion. Killing them is protecting the family. Her mind fractured so severely that she believed murder was a solution. This is the terrifying intersection of mental illness and violence, when delusion merges with narcissism, when paranoia mixes with control, when trauma becomes identity. The results can be catastrophic. 2. The survivors. What happened after escaping Theresa Knorr? Theresa's surviving children did not simply walk away from the horror. They carried it. Trauma follows. It sticks to the skin. It whispers in the dark. It becomes a part of you. Robert Knorr Jr. The guilt of participating in the torture of his sisters weighed on him. He struggled with addiction. He drifted between homelessness and prison. He could not outrun the memories. In 1991, he committed a murder of his own, killing a woman during an attempted robbery. He was sentenced to life in prison. His life was destroyed long before he ever committed a crime. Theresa's abuse planted seeds of rage, guilt, instability, and emotional collapse that never left him. William Billy Knorr, less is publicly known. He maintained a low profile. He suffered from depression, anxiety, PTSD. He wanted to disappear, to never be associated with the Knorr name again. Theresa Terry Knorr Jr., the youngest child, the one who escaped. Her courage is the reason this case was solved. A P. Her voice finally broke decades of silence. She battled homelessness, trauma, trust issues, nightmares, depression, but she rebuilt her life. She gave testimony. She named her sisters. She ensured the world knew the truth. She made sure Suesan and Sheila were no longer forgotten. 3. Society's blind spot. How abuse can hide in plain sight. The Knorr case reveals a disturbing truth. Extreme abuse can occur right next door, and no one sees it. Why? Because abusers isolate their victims. Children learn to remain silent. Neighbors assume it's not their business. Schools never know because the children are removed. Family doesn't ask questions. Society believes mothers are naturally nurturing. Theresa weaponized society's blind spots. She used motherhood as a disguise. She used her role to shield herself from suspicion. She used the silence of her children as evidence of her innocence. And because the crimes happened behind closed doors, the world never asked. This is one of the most chilling lessons of this case. Monsters don't always look like monsters. Sometimes they look like the person who brought you into the world. 4. The patterns. Why female killers like Theresa are so rare, yet so dangerous. Women who kill their children fall into several psychological categories. Sadistic mothers, violence as control, torture as discipline. Theresa Knorr is in this category, one of the rarest and most disturbing forms. Sadistic maternal killers don't act impulsively. They plan, they isolate, they manipulate, they escalate. And the danger comes not from a moment of rage, but from years of deliberate cruelty. 5. The legacy of Theresa Knorr. What her case teaches us. When Theresa Knorr died in prison in 2022, the world barely noticed. A small obituary, a brief mention in local news, a few lines in a report, no memorial, no flowers, no tears. But the lessons from her case, the horrors her daughters endured, these cannot disappear. Her story teaches us, A. Abuse thrives in silence. When society avoids uncomfortable truths, abusers flourish. B. Mothers can be abusers too. This goes against cultural norms, but it's crucial to recognize. C. Delusion can turn ordinary homes into prisons. Mental illness, power, equals lethal combination. D. Siblings are often forced into roles they never asked for. Trauma doesn't just destroy victims, it destroys witnesses. E. Escape is not betrayal. Escape is survival. And most importantly, if someone had intervened earlier, 2 young women might still be alive. 6. Suesan and Sheila, restoring their names. For nearly a decade, the world knew them only as Jane Doe and Jane Doe. 2 unidentified girls, 2 forgotten victims, 2 lives reduced to evidence bags and coroner notes. But their names deserve to be spoken. Theresa Knorr, Sheila Knorr. They were daughters. They were sisters. They were human beings. And this documentary, this series, is part of restoring their humanity. Not as victims, not as headlines, but as girls who deserved love, safety, and a life their mother stole from them. 7. The final reflection. The story of Theresa Knorr is a story of what happens when pain becomes identity, when paranoia becomes reality, when motherhood becomes tyranny. It is a story of 2 young girls who never had a chance, and 3 surviving siblings who carry the scars of a childhood stolen. But it is also a story of truth breaking through lies, a story of survival, a story of voices finally being heard. And as we close this episode, as we step back from the darkness of the Knorr home, we are left with questions that echo far beyond this case. How many stories like this go unnoticed? How many children suffer in silence? How many abusers hide behind the mask of motherhood? How many deaths are mistaken for accidents? How many cries for help go unheeded? This is not just a true crime story. This is a warning. A reminder that evil does not always wear a mask. Sometimes it wears a mother's face. Before we end this episode, I want to leave you with one final thought. Stories like this don't just reveal what happened inside one home. They reveal the cracks inside our society, the warnings we miss, the signs we ignore, the people who suffer in silence. If this story moved you, if it disturbed you, if it made you question how something so evil could hide in plain sight, then I invite you to stay with me on this journey. This series will continue uncovering the darkest corners of America, the killers no one saw coming, the mothers and fathers who turned their children into victims, and the cases where the truth is far more terrifying than the headlines ever revealed. So before you go, do one thing for me. Hit like, not because you enjoyed this story, but because it helps the victims' names stay alive. Subscribe so you don't miss the next case in this series. And leave a comment below. What warning signs do you think society missed? And what case should I cover next? Your engagement helps this channel grow, and more importantly, it helps these victims' stories reach the people who need to hear them. Thank you for watching. Stay safe. And remember, sometimes the dead do speak, if we're willing to listen.